Everyone, we're going to give it a few seconds to let people trickle in. Okay, well, hello everyone and welcome to Houser Hour. This is a chance for SCAMP members to hear from pro-housing elected officials from across the state. Today we'll be hearing from Sacramento City Council member Katie Valenzuela. And before we dive in and I introduce our moderator, I just wanted to do a few housekeeping. No questions will be taken during today's session. We try to get them beforehand. Second, this is recorded, and so I'll send it out to all of you following the presentation today. And then finally, one of the topics that we'll be talking about today is about the city's, or about California's pro-housing designation. And one thing that I wanted to talk about briefly now, and I'll send out emails as we do, we will have a workshop focused on the tips and what's needed to get a pro-housing designation for our cities. So stay tuned for that. And with that, I'm really excited to introduce our moderator for today, Monica Mejia. She is the CEO of ELAC, East LA Community Corporation. And with that, I will pass it over to you.
Hi, thanks, Ariana. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Housers Hour. I'm obviously Monica Mejia. I'm with ELAC, East LA Community Corporation. And ELAC is an affordable housing nonprofit and financial services nonprofit. We do tax preparation, first-time home buyer programs, as well as the affordable housing. We're pretty much based in Boyle Heights and East LA. And I'm so glad to be here to introduce you all to Katie Valenzuela. And we get a chance to hear from Katie all about Sacramento's pro-housing designation. Which is a capitalized term, and the ways we can learn from Sacramento as to how they build affordable housing. Katie was elected in 2020 to serve on the Sacramento City Council for District 4. Katie is an advocate for economic justice, housing and economic justice, and she's working to elevate the voices of the frontline community with the state capitol and with the Newsom administration. Katie has over 10 years of policy and community organizing experience. Katie was a founding member of the Sacramento Community Land Trust and the Sacramento Urban Agriculture Coalition, and she was co-chair of the state's Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, and she was the first consultant for the Joint Legislative Committee on Climate Change Policies at the California Legislature. Katie was born and raised in Oildale, California, and holds a bachelor's and master's degree in community development from UC Davis. We are all excited to have you with us today, Katie.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, let's dive into the pro-housing designation, which allows for certain cities to receive additional points and preferences for state funding for housing development. Programs like cap and trade programs, for example. Sacramento was the first city to receive this designation by the state. Can you talk more a little bit about how Sacramento got it? What did you guys enact in order to receive this designation, and what has changed in terms of building affordable housing after receiving this award from the state of California?
Yeah, thank you. And we were really excited to be the first city. We are still, I believe, as of yesterday, the only city who's gotten the pro-housing designation in California. And it really spoke to years of work, some of which started before I took office, some of which I've got to witness and participate in since taking office. Everything from reducing or eliminating parking requirements, reducing or eliminating fees for affordable units, not just affordable housing projects, which means we're also incentivizing market rate developers to bring in more affordable units to their projects to get those fees reduced. We have done all sorts of things to make it easier to get approvals, including by right development in certain zones and staff level approvals that don't require going to Planning Commission or to the council unless they're appealed. So there's been quite a move to make it easier, and our planning staff, I mean, outside of those policy changes, they've really adopted a policy of accessibility. I've I've seen them work countless meetings, community meetings, project team meetings to help development teams understand the requirements, navigate through the city process. So by the time their application is submitted, they have what they need to be successful. So only great feedback for our planning team. So they applied for this. This is not something that the state is going out and looking for cities to apply. We apply for a pro-housing designation, which is something we approved when we voted on our housing element last year and won the award. And have been really excited to see not just the increased partnership with the state. We have gotten several grants that, it's hard to know if you're getting it because of those extra few points or just because it was a cool application to start with. But we are aggressively pursuing every funding opportunity at the state now because we want to make sure to take full advantage of those extra points while we're the only one that has them.
That's so impressive, so amazing for Sacramento. Congratulations, you guys. That's really amazing story. One of the efforts that Sacramento has taken is to reduce parking requirements. And here in LA, we have a lot of cars. And this receives a lot of pushback from residents. What kind of response do we give to constituents who might get upset about reduction in parking requirements?
I think it's really important that parking reductions don't happen in isolation. And we've really tested this in Sacramento, and we've seen the good and the not so good of eliminating parking requirements. For example, if you don't have a residential parking zone around those buildings, people just park in the street, right? And they start to take over street parking. We've had landlords who haven't told tenants that the unit they're renting doesn't include any parking access. And so we've had people reach out to say, wait a minute, I'm not eligible for a residential permit and I have a car. What do I do? We've also worked really proactively to consolidate parking in available lots. So most cities have available parking lots that they control or manage that we've been able to say, we can, instead of you building more parking here, how about we give you access to some spots that are over here, maybe a block or two away, so that we're still able to have access for some vehicles, but you don't need to use that space, because it really is a matter of space and money. This takes money away from affordable units that could be being built, and it also takes physical space away from what could be amenities for residents or additional units. So this is something that, when done intentionally, can work very well. And we see plenty of people who are willing to say, give up a parking space because they're going to move into a new unit that's close to where they work, that's close to transit, that's close to other modes of transportation. But communication and intentionality are really key to making it work. And some of the concerns have been based on not following best practices. So as we're moving forward with making that more universal through compliance with the new statewide ADU laws and other things, we're really trying to take proactive steps to implement those best practices so that we don't see the unintended consequence of simply starving the streets for more parking when that may already be a precious commodity.
Wow. It's an amazing story for Sacramento. We need to address the homelessness and housing crisis from multiple angles: investing in affordable housing, renter protections, services for low income and the unhoused. What is the city of Sacramento's current focus when it comes to addressing the crisis? And where do you think it should be?
We are really focused on how do we subsidize more projects. So we've had a lot of conversation about bonding general fund money to create a larger trust fund, because we have a lot of projects that are in the queue, as I'm sure a lot of cities do, that aren't getting the gap funding that they need quite yet to be able to break ground and move forward on their projects. We estimate that we have several thousand units that are kind of waiting in the wings of where parcels have been secured, plans have been developed, but that funding just isn't there to get those units constructed. And anybody on this call, including yourself, who builds affordable units, knows how frustrating that process can be when you're just a couple $1 million away from creating housing for dozens, if not hundreds of people. So we've been really talking about how do we use our general fund resources to create more of that revenue so we can invest or at least loan more money to affordable housing developers. We've talked about public banking in Sacramento, which is a state law that allows jurisdictions to create their own public public banks. Sacramento, we manage all of our own investments. We manage all of our water. And we are a unique city that we hold on to. A lot of our assets are actually managed in-house. So if we created a public bank, we could actually generate quite a bit of revenue and potential opportunities to help with more housing projects so we get more of those units built. I will say, though, that one of the biggest deficits in the city of Sacramento is that we did lose our inclusionary housing requirement almost 10 years ago. There is no requirement for developers to build affordable units. And the fee that we replaced it with was a fraction. It was literally 1/5 of what the Nexus study said it could have been 10 years ago. So right now, our development fees are only generating about $1 million a year into our 2 housing trust funds, which is nothing. And part of the reason why we're having to scramble to figure out how are we going to make up the gap in projects. So we are currently in the process of trying to bring that back. We're doing our study right now of other inclusionary policy cities. And I'm hopeful that by the end of the year, we'll be moving forward a discussion about how to strengthen those requirements. Because similar to other cities, including Southern California, I think we might have you beat in fastest growing rents right now. Some of the new units that are studios are going for $3,000 a month, and our average median income is still 60 grand. In my part of downtown, in Midtown Sacramento, it's 34 grand is the average median income. So we need to really confront this crisis, because that's part of why the shelter crisis is so acute, right? It's not people are falling into homelessness who have revenue, who have income from disability, from retirement, from a low income job that aren't able to find units they can afford. And the shelters are full of people who've gotten back on their feet, who've gotten jobs, who can't move out because they can't find a place that will accept their vouchers. They can't find places that they can afford on their new salaries. So these 2 things really do go hand in hand. And even in our point in time count, which you probably saw the news that our numbers are higher than San Francisco, which is not a headline that I like to see as a local official here. One of the rays of sunshine in that report was that we had less new people becoming homeless than we thought we would, which was attributed to the fact that they thought the emergency rent assistance and the eviction moratoriums helped keep more people from becoming homeless during the pandemic. So there are good lessons that we're learning and clear obstacles that we need to confront. If we're going to be serious, our policies have taken a good step in creating more units, but we are not nearly where we need to be in building the affordable units that we desperately need.
Yeah, it's really a hard time for so many working people who, maybe they have one job, but they can't do 2 or 3 anymore. And that's what happens.
Yeah, and you can't put a family in a studio apartment that's 500 square feet. That just doesn't work.
Yeah, oh my God. So my next question is a little bit about renters versus homeowners. And so while homeownership is harder as home values increase, the lack of affordable housing hits renters the hardest. You've spoken about being one of the few elected officials who is a renter. And some people have even questioned your dedication to Sacramento because you don't own a home. How do you think the lack of renters in positions of power, influence, or hurts California's push for more affordable housing? Is there a solution other than just electing more renters to the office?
Well, electing more renters would be great, but I am the only renter on Sacramento City Council, even though almost half of our population are renters, and that number is growing. It's the big part of why I ran was because, at the time we had 0 tenant protections. We had no even cap on rent increases, which now we do. We had nobody in office who was really speaking to the real pressure that we were already starting to feel 4 years ago that has now become even more acute coming out of the pandemic. So it is a perspective that I think is really important. And it is incredibly harmful to hear people say things to me like, you don't own property, so you shouldn't have a voice in how our city is governed, because that is just straight up racist. And that is from a legacy of very racialized policies in our country that have been long gone, but are still pervasive in how people view those of us who don't own property as somehow second-class citizens. When I am paying, they say, you don't know what it's like to pay property taxes. And I say, how do you think my landlord's paying his property taxes? He's not paying that out of pocket. He's paying it with the money that I give him. And I don't have the security of knowing that I can be here long term. I can't borrow against the equity that he is building in this building as he pays his payments every month. So this is a real different situation and an important note that I think needs to be reflected on all city councils. But I think the best thing that has happened in Sacramento is that our tenants have really started organizing. And thanks to our tenants union, thanks to other efforts to get into buildings to really organize, we now have a better idea of what's happening. This is now getting to council when we're starting to see landlords violate the law, when there's trends. For instance, our tenant eviction protections don't take effect for a year. So it might be a just cause at a year, but any day short of a year, they can evict you without a just cause and not have to pay you any money for relocation or take any of the steps we deem necessary after a year. That's not right. I don't understand the policy justification for that. So now we have tenant groups who are talking about times that their tenants have been evicted just short of 12 months to try to make the case that this policy is harming people. It's causing more housing burden on them, and it's increasing the likelihood that renters might end up on the street when they now are finding themselves unable to move successfully into a new unit. So these are the types of organizing in the community, and I think tenants groups collecting data, working collaboratively with nonprofit providers to get an idea of wait lists, of number of times people have had to call for legal services. These numbers are really important to help bring back to elected bodies to help make the case for why stronger policy is necessary. But it is hard when, I remember when the numbers came out, I don't remember exactly of how many members of our state legislature are landlords, right? And how many people on our city councils are landlords. And it's hard not to view policy through self-interest when you're thinking of a scenario about what if, and the organizing groups for the apartment association are all too ready to put forward small landlords as tokenized people to say, this is who you're hurting, even though most of the policies are really oriented towards more corporate and larger landlord groups and property management companies. So it is incredibly frustrating to see that persist, because I think there is a way for us to be really intentional about how we treat someone who truly is just renting out a unit or two and qualifies as a small landlord versus someone who owns dozens of units and really does have the capital and the administration capacity to treat their tenants to a different standard. So I think those are conversations that we will continue to have as tenants become more organized and as they start pushing for policy and frankly for the types of elected officials that will be responsive to their concerns.
Yeah. Wow, you've gone through a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I never even occurred to me there was such a bias in all these decision makers.
Yeah, it happens quite frequently, and I shudder to think how many times I've had a constituent throw back at me, well, you don't own property, so you don't really have a stake in this. It's just, it's really, really harmful. And part of why I think it's so important, even if I was able to figure out how to buy a home in this market, which is a whole question in and of itself, because I'm not a millionaire, and that seems to be the only ones who can in my district right now. It's still really important for there to be a renter voice listed. And I think I would choose to stay a renter at this point, just to ensure that I really understood the experience firsthand and had that perspective to continue to bring forward.
Yeah, and thank you so much for that, for getting Sacramento where it is. So the city of LA just voted to expand its no encampment law, and it looks like a similar measure will be placed on the ballot in November for Sacramento. You have expressed opposition to this measure. Can you talk more about the Emergency Shelter and Enforcement Act of 22, which is a Sacramento proposition, and what you envision as an alternative to this measure?
Absolutely. And it looks very similar because it was written by the same people who organized the lawsuits against the city and county of Los Angeles, came to the city of Sacramento and threatened us. They fundraised with business groups to run a citizens measure that was poised to potentially qualify for the ballot that would have bankrupted the city of Sacramento, hands down, no question. The way the thresholds were set, the rate that we would have needed to expand, the amount of litigation that would have ensued, we would not have survived survived that measure. So this measure that's been put forward was the compromise that was struck, that we would put something on the ballot and they would pull their harmful measure off from signature gathering, and that we would put something forward voluntarily, which I put air quotes whenever I say voluntarily, because it really wasn't a voluntary issue. It was either that or potentially face a crushing measure that could have been put on the ballot this November. So it's incredibly harmful for a lot of reasons. The first reason being that our focus on enforcement is incredibly cruel when we don't have the shelter spaces and housing available. If we had the shelter spaces and housing available, we would not be having this conversation. A lot of folks on the street will accept the appropriate services if offered to them. A lot of them are on wait lists. Most of them have been in and out of different sheltering, either short-term or long-term experiences, and have ended up back on the street for a myriad of reasons that are largely not always their fault. This is the sort of problem that we keep avoiding the obvious solution, which is we need more shelter and housing, and jumping to, well, let's just tell you that you can't be here, which only moves people from one location to another. And research shows not only does it increase the likelihood that someone will resist services when offered, it increases injection drug use, it increases overdoses and suicide. This is something that is incredibly harmful, particularly to those who are already most vulnerable on our streets, those who've been abused, those with PTSD, those with outstanding social, emotional, or substance abuse challenges. So this is something that I think is incredibly frustrating for me, because the solution is providing those options. And for a city like Sacramento, we are very different than LA in a key reason, which is that our total annual budget is $1.3 billion. That's total. That's all of our water services, that's all of our safety services, that's all of our parks and youth services, that's everything. And so we don't have the amount of money that either the city of LA has, but definitely that the county of Sacramento has. Their budget is about 3 to 5 times bigger than ours. We also don't run social services. We don't run mental health services. We don't run drug services. This is something that is a distinctly and deliberately county function. They have health departments for this reason. So the first part was that it's frustrating for folks to target cities for these sort of services, because we can't offer these services. The money doesn't trickle down to us for this. You're punishing us for not having something available that isn't our job to provide. We need to aim this appropriately at the counties when there is a real deficit in services available. But I also think the shelter part of this is super important. So in the city of Sacramento, we don't have a lot of vacant land. We don't own a lot of vacant land. We actually just did an exhaustive search of public parcels, and we maybe have space for a couple hundred more people. And we don't have the space to do this within the city. The county is in a very different space. They have old Air Force bases. They have old juvenile facilities that have shut down that could be repurposed. They have facilities to do this in. So for me, the context is super important, because what this is doing is setting up a very frustrated electorate to potentially have citizen action rights against the city if they don't see enough shelters opening, if we can't move camps because we don't have any place for them to go. And that just feeds into a very harmful narrative that isn't focused on what do we need in terms of solutions. We need mental health and substance abuse beds. We need more shelter beds, and we need faster development of affordable housing, which is something that's our responsibility that we've honestly neglected for way, way too long. So the triage part of this, in my mind, has always squarely fallen in the county's hands. They hold those services. They are the emergency responders. That is part of what they're supposed to offer. And when it comes to cities, we need to be figuring out how to get serious about meeting our affordable housing needs so we can free up space in those shelters and we can keep people from reaching the streets in the first place. So in the end, I guess if I wanted to summarize why I'm opposed to this measure, is it's not a real solution. It's packaging itself as a real solution, and it's going to galvanize electorate voters who are really frustrated, but it's another waste of time. It's another false promise that won't deliver on what they want, because we're not putting the ingredients for success on the table. And that means actually listening to the service providers and the outreach workers and the mutual aid folks when they say that we don't need this, we need that. Why aren't we doing that thing that we know we need that would open the door to everybody getting the relief that we desperately want? So it has been an incredibly frustrating and undemocratic process. There has been litigation filed against the measure in Sacramento. There's a hearing set next week to try to pull it off the ballot, filed by civil rights organizations. This is the same thing over and over again, like with care courts at the state level, like with other enforcement approaches. Like, why don't we give people a chance to actually access the services that don't exist at scale before we start talking about what it's going to take to force them to do what we want. That's sort of the basic premise here for me.
Yeah. Wow, that's an amazing story that it's the same people that came from LA.
Yep.
They went up there. What does the city and county relationship look like in addressing homelessness? How are they working together in your part of town?
It's been strange. I'll be honest. It's been a hard nut to crack. There are conversations happening now that we're all really hopeful will result in a type of partnership agreement where we can talk about what the city can do, what the county needs to do, and how we move forward together. But it has been really tough. And I think part of why it's tough is I think my county colleagues are justifiably really defensive that they don't feel like they take the blame for what's happening on the streets right now. And I get that. It was no one entity's fault that the crisis has reached the level that it is in Sacramento. But to move forward, we absolutely need their substance abuse and mental health expertise. We absolutely need their funding. We absolutely need some of the sites that they have in their jurisdiction that we don't have access to as a city if we're going to scale the services at the pace that's required to meet this moment. So we have been really working hard. I know I've offered city staff time. I've, offered people, I'm like, you can stand at the press conference and take all the credit. I don't even care. I'm like, you can stand up there and say, I did this thing, but it doesn't seem to be working. And I think part of the crisis really comes down to it's hard to know where to start. Like we've gone past the point where when some of these folks first got into office, we were talking about maybe a couple thousand people. Now there are advocates saying that there might be 20,000 people on the street any given night in Sacramento. That is a staggering number. And it's hard to imagine how you move forward in a way that would make an impact on that type of need. But we have to start putting one foot in front of the other and figuring this out. And I think any one of us at the city, I feel pretty confident to talk on behalf of my city colleagues and the mayor, we would gladly step aside and we will gladly do whatever it will take to help pave the way for the county to start taking that work on. A good example, unfortunately, is that when our county of Sacramento got CARES money, which was the first round of federal coronavirus relief funding from the federal level, they got over $100 million. They did not spend $1 of that on housing. They did not spend $1 of that on services. They did not spend $1 of that on this crisis. They gave it to the sheriff of Sacramento County, who at the time was refusing to even enforce coronavirus protective orders, who's very known as a very vocal Trump supporter, who thankfully just lost his run for Congress. And we're all very excited to bring a new sheriff in next year. But it's very frustrating to see opportunities like that get passed up. And so a grand jury report came out basically like saying, you messed up on this. This money shouldn't have been worked. And I know now they're working on investing that money retroactively into the right things. But that sort of money could be a game changer at a crisis like this for us to procure the space and the resources and the professionals that we're going to need to go out into the community. But, one step at a time, and there's no way we move forward without them. So I will always hold the hope that an agreement is on the horizon and we will figure this out. But it is a real question, I think, for state governments to talk about what do you do in situations like that? What do we do in a city like Sacramento when our county has launched a mental health response team that refuses to come into our city limits? What do we do when we're seeing funding sitting on a shelf that isn't being spent that could help us alleviate our massive reentry population that is ending up in our shelters and on our streets because there is no place for them to go? Like, these are questions that fall squarely in a county jurisdictional bucket. So I will always hold out hope that an agreement is possible. But I have to say, when I came into office as a city council member, I might have been a naive organizer, but I really thought, oh, maybe it's just because nobody's done it yet, or maybe it's because nobody's presented a new idea. Maybe it's just a personality issue and I'm new and I have relationships with these guys and it's going to work. And now I sit here 2 years later, very publicly, as you can tell, saying it's not working. We need their help, and no city can do this without a county partnership that's robust and meaningful.
Wow. Yeah. Considering how many challenges the city already has, it's tough to have one more there.
Yeah.
Okay. So in Sacramento, you have implemented safe camping sites. Can you talk more about how these work, how many folks live in them, and what services are provided, as well as what pushback you may have for those, and what are some of the success stories?
Absolutely. We started safe camping in my district shortly after I took office. I took office in December 2020, and in January 2021, Caltrans said, "Hey, so what's the plan for the 300 tents under this freeway when we start construction?" And I said, "What?" like, what are you saying? And so they were potentially going to displace hundreds of people from under their overpasses when they started construction on a highway in my district, going through the middle of my district. So we worked very quickly with them to actually identify a parking lot that they weren't going to use to offer as a voluntary safe camping space. So these are spaces that are not mandated. Once you're in them, we don't lock you in. You can enter and exit as you please. Folks voluntarily leave or come in all the time, where people are staffed 24/7. There's bathrooms, there's food, and there's case management. Folks are starting to work with you to figure out what your challenges are and to work with you to make a plan to get into housing. So that first safe camping site, we served right around 400 people. We had almost half leave for positive exits into shelter. Some folks went to housing programs or treatment programs. Others actually reunited with their family, when they were able to sleep regularly and talk to someone who was a professional. We were able to convince them to reach out to family members who welcomed them home with open arms to get the help they needed there. So it was really incredible. We did have to shut it down, both because the Caltrans project is winding down, but also because Caltrans, one of the big lessons learned is you need an MOU with any surrounding property owners to manage any encampments that might spring up outside of the safe camping area. We did not have that with Caltrans. We had a lot of camps spring up outside of the safe camping area that caused a lot of issues within the area and to the nearby neighbors. So we set up a new one that is completely managed by the city, completely controlled by our property at Miller Park. It's a 60 tent facility. We've already had 25 people move out for positive outcomes, which is just opened in February. So that's in about 6 months. We've been able to really replicate the examples from the first model and bring those into a more successful situation. It's kind of beautiful. It's on the side of a river. It's really nice. And, there's community groups there every weekend with warm meals, with food and clothes and different things for the residents, which we also provide them. But it's just nice to have the community really embrace that site. But as you can imagine, if you think there's pushback on a traditional shelter site or affordable housing site, try proposing a safe camping area in a neighborhood, because people lost it. And part of why they were so frustrated and upset was because they were picturing the camps on the street, what I'd call like an unregulated encampment, right? Like they thought that we were basically just going to bring an encampment to their area and let it go free reign. And they didn't understand how it worked. We also got a lot of pushback, frankly, from advocates who were frustrated that it was still outdoors, who didn't feel like it was a sufficient option for shelter, which I never claimed that this is shelter. It's been co-opted by the folks who are suing the city of LA and working on the Sacramento measure to say this is shelter. It's not shelter. Shelter has a roof, shelter has doors, shelter has structure and safety that an outdoor camping site doesn't provide. But for some folks who've been outside for a long time, moving to an outdoor camping area that's got a light structure to it, that's got light rules, can be really a great step towards getting them closer to being ready to move into the next shelter or services or whatever's next for them. So we get a lot of pushback on these sites. I have proposed 3 other sites in addition to the 3 that I've opened that didn't move forward for different reasons, that got a ton of community pushback. Folks, showing up at meetings, folks screaming at us on a regular basis about how dare you. But the reality is folks were already in those neighborhoods. We were just trying to provide them a place to be so that they didn't have to worry about enforcement and could maybe start getting some of the steps and foundation together to move into their next step to getting housed.
Wow. Thank goodness you keep looking for compassionate solutions, Katie. Thank goodness for that. Okay. So a little bit of a shift now. There's so many topics to talk about with your background. You have a background in sustainability consulting as well. Can you talk more about the intersection of sustainability and housing justice? What efforts has the city taken towards a green transition when it comes to the housing sector, for example?
Absolutely. I'm very honored to work with environmental justice groups back where I grew up, mostly in Kern County and the Central Valley, to help them with state policy work. And housing is a huge piece of this. And I think a lot of you on this call probably know that the further out people are forced to move to find affordable housing is bad for our climate and is bad for those families. Now they're having to commute to get to work, to school, to services. And if they end up on the street, that is also means that you're making them even more vulnerable to the ongoing changes in our climate. They're even more at risk in case of emergency, if there's a flood, if there's a fire, if there's bad air days. These sort of things really impact people on the streets more than any of us. And so there's a whole progression of steps that it takes to make sure that housing really is a key climate justice strategy. And a lot of us who do environmental justice work for a long time have learned, unfortunately, that we need to also be housing advocates, because when you start making improvements in a neighborhood that's been left behind, that's been redlined, that's not been invested in, and you start bringing that investment and those new amenities, you immediately turn around and have to fight back gentrification and displacement, right? And so there is a sort of hand-in-hand thing with environmental issues and housing, that having a safe and affordable place to be, close to where you need to go for work, for school, for what have you, is a key climate justice strategy, and something that I know we're really trying to address through things like eliminating single family zoning in the city of Sacramento. That's something we're poised to do with our general plan update this year. We've already approved the initial zoning changes to move forward to that next step, so that we can try to increase the amount of housing stock in neighborhoods that have historically been really well located to services and jobs, but have traditionally been segregated for more affluent and frankly more white households. So this is an opportunity for us to be really thoughtful, but just like with the parking requirement, it only works if it's hand in glove with other policies to ensure that we're protecting the nearby folks from speculation, that we're giving homeowners resources to maintain their homes so they don't get displaced and feel like they have to sell to a speculator who might come and make them an offer that they feel like they can't refuse. These things need to be part of a holistic solution, but it is a critical climate justice issue. It's part of how we're going to be able to sustain transit and all the great services. But I will also say that there's a mixture. This is really about locating in high opportunity areas. There's the other side of the coin, which is how do we make neighborhoods that are already built out more sustainable? And how do we make sure that they have what they need so that they don't always have to go to another part of town to get access to good grocery stores or good schools, So I see all of this as very interconnected, but housing in and of itself is part of a legacy of why people of color are more likely to be located in neighborhoods that are hit first and worst by climate, that are more polluted, that have more of these burdens, and confronting that is part of how we're going to increase justice across the spectrum.
The two hand in hand. Yeah, that's really something we're working on here in Los Angeles as well. We're trying to protect our vulnerable neighborhoods from market pressures, and at the same time bring environmental upgrades. It's really hard to do both at once.
Absolutely.
But they go together. There seems to be an effort to collect signatures for a recall for your position. Unfortunately, many pro-housing elected persons across the state are facing similar recall attempts. We saw that down here in LA, my own council member, Mike Bonin as well, and Nithya Raman. Can you talk a little bit more about what's happening behind these recall efforts, and how can we as residents support our elected when these situations arise? What do you think is motivating pushback, and how do we balance that as voters, and how do we address this conflict?
Yeah, it's a really scary trend that's impacting a lot of us. I was mentioning before the webinar began that I met recently at a local elected officials meeting of someone who'd been attempted to be recalled 7 times. He got served petitions to recall him. We all seem to have a very similar story when it comes to confronting real estate and development interests, when it comes to pushing for shelter, for affordable housing, for renters. This dynamic around housing housing and homelessness really does feel to be a driving force that these folks are using to both get donations and to push back and to try to attack us as being harmful to their neighborhoods in some direct way. I know for me personally, it started when I started trying to find safe camping locations in more affluent parts of my district. The homelessness crisis is everywhere, and we're finding people all over the city, including in those neighborhoods. And I tried to propose a couple of safe parking or camping locations just to provide that immediate relief to folks who wanted it, and got a very vicious pushback from some of the folks who are now organizing my recall effort. They're on their second petition. They keep not getting the signatures they need. I think they seem to think not that that means that the public doesn't want this, but that they just need to try again. So I'm hearing rumors of a third petition in the future. It's unfortunately tone deaf to what's going on, but the money behind these is super clear. At least I can speak for the committee that's organizing against me. Most of their money is coming from real estate interests, and that's very clear. When you look down the list, it is what it is, and a couple of oil industry lobbyists just for fun. So I think it's super clear what we're pushing up against. And part of what's hard is what we need more people in our neighborhoods to do is to push back, is to say, no, we don't want this. No, you don't speak for me. They keep thinking somehow that they're just missing the mark. And they say to me often that they think they represent my district. And I know they don't, because I hear from others in my district all the time who are saying they don't speak for me. I don't like this. I agree with what you're doing. I want to help. And the biggest thing you can do to help is to try to push back on that narrative, to continue to put out pro-housing comments, to keep supporting the shelter sites that are in your district, to support housing projects in your district. And I don't mean a blind blank check in any way. We don't want to just say, oh, build whatever you want everywhere. That's not what I'm saying at all. But when you see a project that's good, it could be in a different part of town, call into council to say you support that. They need to start hearing more. I think what I've learned in local office is that when people like what they see, they don't say anything, because they're like, oh, she's doing great. I love what she's doing. They're not calling into council or emailing us to say, hey, good job. Some people do, and it's wonderful when that happens, but you do need to start speaking up when you see things that are working well. Otherwise, that vocal minority who thinks they speak for you is going to take that silence as consent. And it's super important that we continue to organize with each other. You have more neighbors on your block than you might think you do who agree with you. There might be one really loud person on next door, and you go around and chat with some of your other neighbors and they're all saying, yeah, we don't agree with them. You all need to say something and organize to push back, because that's really where it starts and catches hold. We saw things in like Stockton when they ousted Michael Tubbs from his mayorship. That started as one guy with an online blog, just continuing to put out negative piece, negative piece, negative piece. And if that's not actively confronted, then that becomes the dominant narrative. So we're working really hard to try to strategize on this, but sometimes it can't come from us as elected officials, because we give the recall too much of a voice. When we do that, it needs to always come from our constituents. And so the most you can take those steps, I think, and I've seen some brilliant work by my constituents in writing letters to editors and sending emails to folks and talking back on Facebook and Nextdoor saying, no, that's not what I think. Unhoused people are welcome in my neighborhood. I think they're great. If they have the services they need, let's do this. That sort of comments are really important to confronting that toxicity that is unfortunately focused on California, I think, because we are making such great strides and trying so hard to solve these issues.
Goodness. Well, it gives me some hope, though. That if constituents continue to speak up, they have a chance to sort of fight back against the power of wealth, which is part of the story I've been hearing from you this whole time, is how much wealth and the real estate industry can influence things with their lawsuits and their financial pressure. To sort of try to derail you, but I'm glad they haven't yet, Katie. You stay strong. Don't let go yet.
Thanks.
All right. Okay, so Sacramento is a medium-sized, large city with a metropolitan population of just over 2 million people. The 5-county scam region, our area, has almost 20 million people, 10 times it's big. And it includes rural areas, exurbs, suburbs. It's the second biggest city in the county, or Los Angeles, in the country. Do you think the struggles for affordable housing are the same in Sacramento and here in Southern California? Are they different? Can we learn from the work you do in Sacramento?
I do think I thought a lot about this, and I do think that they're similar, obviously not in scale. When we build an 80-unit complex, we're super excited. In LA, I probably wouldn't even notice that on the evening news. But, I think that there are very similar challenges. The policies to support affordable housing development, not just what we did in pro-housing designation work in terms of streamlining, eliminating requirements, waiving fees, but the other side of that, when we talk about inclusionary, around fee collection, around making sure you have a sustainable plan for how do you finance and support these units, is really critical. And I think there's very common strategies popping up in cities across the state. Like I believe ELAC in the SAC CLT and the Oakland CLT and Santa Ana, and I think I'm forgetting Trust South LA, just talked about how do we finance land trust type work more so we can start buying more existing buildings and start preserving more housing and more properties through this method of just pulling it out of the market. It's such a simple idea to just say, nope, this is ours now, and the community is going to manage it. But I think there's a lot of mechanisms in a state that has very similar regulations, grant opportunities across the board that we can strategize together and really learn from each other and what's working. I know I'm looking at the cities that have inclusionary, that have stronger rent protections as making the case for me in Sacramento to try to push harder on those policies. And I hope folks will look towards our policies of parking requirements and different strategies we've developed and use that as justification to push in your cities as well. Cars are expensive, for example. I think most folks, if you really say, don't want to sit on the freeway for an hour to get somewhere. So if we can provide a real alternative, and if the work in Sacramento can be helpful, I think we face very similar obstacles when it comes to opposition to these projects. And also, obviously, when it comes to homelessness, we're all having the same thing happen. And in some cases, as in the case with these anti-camping ordinances, we're facing the same people who are doing the same policies in your city and in our city. So I think there's a lot that we can and should learn from each other to try to strategize, to work together. If we're successful in getting this measure pulled off the ballot, for instance, I hope you advocates in LA will turn around and say, hey, look, what they tried didn't work up there. We need to push back down here for real solutions that matter for people. So I do believe there's a lot we have in common, and I'm hopeful that this conversation, some of the conversations I've gotten to have with some of your council members at different conferences and events, can really be the beginning of us being a lot more intentional about sharing those strategies and working together to bring solutions forward.
I hope my city council members paying attention. We need a pro-housing designation too.
Yes.
How long it takes, right? For them to get on board. All right, so you are a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA. But as you're aware, we live in a capitalistic society, especially here in California. Given that reality, realistically, what areas of society do you think have the best chance of making inroads with some of what you believe in? Can you talk about the DSA's views on housing?
Absolutely. I was the first member of DSA to be elected to local office in our region. I know you've had greater success in the LA area. So there's been a lot of education on what democratic socialism is and isn't. I always tell people, I'm not trying to come in and take your house or take your business from you. I'm really trying to talk about shared ownership, shared decision making, and how do we move more equitable policies forward. The most famous one being Medicare for all, which during this pandemic, people really started to realize, hey, commodifying in healthcare really doesn't make sense. And when you pull those issues, they make a lot of sense, and they're getting very strong support across, especially Democratic bases, but really community-wide, because people kind of realize, hey, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. And I think the same moment is happening with housing right now. Does it make sense that all housing is commodity the way it is right now? In Sacramento, our developers build buildings and they sell them before they occupy one unit, because it is such a hot investment item for these companies to come in and buy these buildings, knowing that they're going to make their money back and then some in a very short amount of time. And when I talk to even very capitalist-minded constituents, they're bothered by that. They're bothered to hear that first-time home buyers or folks who might be trying to get into the housing market are competing with companies and investment firms, and they don't like that. They don't want to live next door to an investor-owned property. They want to live next door to somebody who's in this neighborhood with them and that they can build community with. And so there is a real moment happening happening right now for housing, where there's new ideas being brought forward that I've been surprised at the amount of interest that there's been from generally more capitalist members of my council and my colleagues and my mayor, in part because it just makes sense now. They're like, okay, if we pull this out of the market, like through a land trust, we can protect that affordability forever. We don't need to keep subsidizing it every year. That makes more financial sense to me. And hey, I don't like the fact that corporate owners are outbidding against maybe a tenant who might be trying to buy their home. Community Opportunity to Purchase Act makes sense. You know, Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act makes sense. These policies for me just make practical sense, because I don't believe there are some things in our community that should always be commodified. We're all gonna, it's like water, you know, the fact that we pay for water just kills me a little bit, because I'm like, you literally will die if you don't have water, just like you will be more likely to die earlier if you don't have housing, if you don't have healthcare. You know, there's just certain things that as a government, we need to try to take steps to ensure are provided for everyone. And I think this pandemic and this crisis of what we're seeing right now is waking up more people to this idea of social housing, as Alex Lee's been pushing at the legislature, to this idea of what would it look like to have certain options. I'm not going to take your home from you, but I'm going to make sure that there's other homes in your neighborhood that are accessible to folks, regardless of how much money they make, because that makes for a better community. And that ensures it's a better investment. It's a wiser investment of our resources than continue to try to subsidize market rate forever. So I think it's a real interesting moment to be a democratic socialist in local government, because we're starting to see the pendulum swing as it does at federal policy, where we're doing more to invest in workers and people and communities, and we're seeing some of the benefits of that. And I'm hopeful that we can cement as much of that as we can into policy and practice, so we can really keep it going and it doesn't accidentally swing back as sometimes our social safety net does. But I think we make a lot of the economic case. And for me, I think it's always like, I tell people I'm not an ideologue. I'm really not. I feel like I'm pushing stuff because I've researched what other cities are doing. We've looked at the case studies. This just makes more sense. And the more sometimes I have to take the words out of it. Like, not many people probably heard me walk into a room and say, hi, I'm a democratic socialist. I don't say that very often, but I do talk about my ideas in terms that people will understand who might not have my values. And then we're really talking about whether this makes sense. And I think some of these ideas, frankly, just make more economic sense, whether you're a socialist or not.
Yeah, which makes you think, huh? Try to find a different system that serves everybody. All right, I have my last question. Let's see here. While the cities of Sacramento and Los Angeles vary greatly, affordable housing providers in both places need strong relationships with their respective cities. What final advice do you have for advocacy groups and nonprofits like my own, wanting to make impactful change at the local level? What advice do you have for us in LA?
Yeah, don't assume that your local decision makers know what's going on, right? Never assume. I think people, I'm always surprised that I think people assume that there's like 10 of me and I'm in each office in the city, just like watching applications as they go or listening to discussion. I don't know sometimes when things are happening with staff at the city, or if there's an issue with something happening, until someone calls me and says, hey, excuse us, we're having this major issue over here, and I can intervene. And so I think building those relationships with your local elected is just so important, so that we can troubleshoot with each other, because sometimes there's real issues that arise. Like right now, we're getting ready to have the conversation in Sacramento about prevailing wages for workers. Some of our unions have raised really good points about how some of our affordable housing projects are paying very substandard wages and how they don't think that's right. But I also hear the affordable housers saying, hey, wait a minute, if you make us pay more, than now our $2 million gap just went to a much more higher gap, and we don't know if we can surmount that challenge. And to me, the blame for that comes on us, because we're not appropriately funding affordable housing, and it shouldn't come down between paying workers well and making sure we have enough money to make projects pencil. So those types of tough conversations can really only happen with relationships, with building understanding, making sure your elected officials. What's been so powerful is we've made each of these changes at the city level is that affordable developers have been there to talk about this in very specific dollars and cents terms. This is what this means for my project. If if you reduce my parking requirement by half. This is what I can do if it's eliminated entirely. This is what we've done in other cities, because a lot of these developers for nonprofits, you don't work just in one city. You know, we have Mercy Housing here. I think they're also in LA. They can swap stories with their electeds and say, this is what it means in Sacramento when I apply. And I really think it can make a difference in LA. So use those relationships and experience to really build understanding with your electeds and with your staff. Part of why we've done such great work, as I've mentioned, is we have amazing planning staff. We have housing policy folks who have great relationships with these developers. So they are able to work really as partners in the project. And then when it gets to me, it's wonderful. But I also have my own relationships and can ask those questions. So I think that to me is the biggest thing, is that people really don't understand how hard it is to build affordable housing. And I've had a lot of my colleagues recently talk about developers as one bucket. And I'm like, no, the nonprofit developers are a different bucket, and you encounter different challenges, and they need to understand what that means so that they can appropriately support you both with resources and with policies to hopefully get you a pro-housing designation so you can pull down those resources, although not too soon, because I want all of them for Sacramento. And okay. But you know, I think those relationships are just super important. A lot of folks come into office with their own thing. Very few of us run for office just on housing issues. And so it's really important to build that capacity so that they can be the champion that you're going to need when these conversations get tough in the neighborhoods or when ordinances come to pass.
Wow, that's great advice. Thank you so much, Katie. And thank you for your time with us. It was really great to learn from you, great for us to learn about Sacramento, all the incredible work you guys are doing up there. Your work is so hard too. I'm so impressed that you keep working for social justice, economic justice, housing justice, and you keep this good fight going. I know it's hard. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, and keep up the good work in LA. We watch you, just like I'm sure you watch all of us to see the cool things so we can say, hey, let's do that up here. So a good stride for you all is a good stride for all of us. So keep up the good work.
All right. Have a great day, Katie. Good luck again.
Thank you.